The silence in the courtroom was a living thing, thick and suffocating. All eyes were on the woman standing before the judge's bench, her clothes neat but worn, her face pale with exhaustion. This was Elena Reyes. Across the room sat the man who had shattered her world millionaire CEO, Richard Blackwood, looking impeccable in a tailored suit. Beside him, his fiancée, the impossibly elegant Isabella Vance, watched with a smirk, a silent predator enjoying the show. And in Elena's arms, a tiny baby boy, oblivious to the life-altering battle being waged in his name. Then, in an act of pure desperation that sent a collective gasp through the room, Elena walked forward and held her child out to the judge. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "If he won't claim his son, then the state can have him. Because I have nothing left." The air in courtroom 3B of the Manhattan Family Court was thick with the scent of old paper and simmering animosity. It was a place where dreams came to die and bitter truths were exhumed under oath. On this Tuesday morning, the case of Reyes vs. Blackwood was the main event, a drama drawing in every court clerk and paralegal who could find an excuse to be there. Elena Reyes stood alone at her plaintiff's table, her only support a young, overwhelmed legal aid lawyer named David Chen. She clutched her 6-month-old son Leo to her chest, his warmth a small anchor in a sea of hostility. Leo was a beautiful baby, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Eyes she knew with a mother's certainty that were the exact shade of his father's. Across the aisle was the fortress of power she was attempting to breach in. Richard Blackwood, the CEO of Blackwood Global, a titan of industry, whose face was a regular feature in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was handsome, chiseled, and radiated an aura of untouchable authority. He refused to even look at her, his gaze fixed on a point just above Judge Carol Thompson's head, as if the proceedings were a minor inconvenience, like a delayed flight. Beside him, practically fused to his arm, was Isabella Vance, heiress to the Vance steel fortune. Isabella was everything Elena was not. Clad in a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than Elena's entire life savings, her blonde hair was styled into a severe, elegant chignon. But it was her smile that cut the deepest. It was a small, tight, knowing smile, a constant silent message broadcast directly to Elena. "You are nothing. You will lose." "Ms. Reyes," Judge Thompson began, her voice devoid of emotion, "you are petitioning this court to establish paternity and seek child support from Mr. Richard Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, through his counsel, has vehemently denied these claims. Is that a fair summary?" David Chen stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. We have evidence of a relationship, text messages, witness stay." "Evidence." A new voice, sharp and predatory, cut through the air. It belonged to Marcus Thorne, Richard Blackwood's lawyer, a man who looked like a shark in a pinstripe suit. "What the plaintiff has, Your Honor, is a collection of out-of-context messages and a desperate fantasy. She was a junior employee, an intern. Mr. Blackwood is a public figure, a target for this kind of extortion." Isabella's smirk widened. She leaned over and whispered something in Richard's ear, and he gave a slight, dismissive shake of his head. They were a united front, a wall of wealth and influence. Elena felt a hot wave of shame and anger. An intern. That's all she was to them now. A footnote in his life that he was trying to erase. She thought of the nights he'd told her he loved her, The promises he'd whispered about a different kind of future, away from the gilded cage of his engagement to Isabella, an engagement he'd claimed was merely a business arrangement. "Your Honor," Thorne continued, his voice booming, "my client has already offered Ms. Reyes a generous severance package out of the goodness of his heart to help a former employee who fell on hard times. She refused. Instead, she chose this circus hoping for a bigger payday by attaching her situation to a man of Mr. Blackwood's stature." Situation. Elena's voice was a choked whisper. "He's a baby. My son." Judge Thompson's eyes, sharp and intelligent, moved from the powerful CEO to the trembling young mother. She had seen this story 100 times before. Power versus poverty. Usually power won. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, addressing him directly for the first time, "have you ever been intimate with Miss Reyes?" Richard finally deigned to look toward Elena, but his eyes were cold, vacant. "Your Honor, I interact with hundreds of employees. I may have shared a coffee with her in the break room. I was always professional. Her claims of a romantic relationship are a complete fabrication." A lie. A cold, calculated, soul-crushing lie. Every word was a dagger. Elena's vision began to tunnel. The legal arguments faded into a dull drone. All she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart and Leo's soft, cooing breaths. She looked at Richard, at the man who had held her, and sworn she was his sanctuary. She looked at Isabella, whose eyes glittered with triumph. She looked at their expensive lawyers, the court stenographer, the impassive judge. They were all part of a system she could never win against. They had money power and a complete disregard for the truth. What did she have? An empty bank account, an eviction notice, and a baby they were treating like a bargaining chip. A terrifying clarity washed over her. She couldn't win. They would bury her in legal fees, drag her name through the mud, and paint her as a mentally unstable gold digger until even she started to believe it. They would break her, and in doing so they would destroy her son's future. Unless she did something they would never expect. Something that wasn't about money. Something that was about truth in its rawest, most undeniable form. Her body moved before her mind had fully caught up. She stood her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. She walked past her stunned lawyer across the hallowed space, separating the two tables, and straight toward the bench. The bailiff took a step forward, but Judge Thompson held up a hand, her eyes wide with curiosity. Elena stopped before the judge. With trembling hands, she adjusted Leo's blanket, kissed his forehead one last time, and held him out. Her voice, when she spoke, didn't tremble. It was clear and resonated with the profound agony of a mother's sacrifice. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Her eyes locked on Judge Thompson's. "I can't give him the life he deserves while they drag us through this hell. They want to say he doesn't exist. They want to pretend he's a situation. Fine." She took one step closer, holding Leo out over the polished wood of the bench. "If his own father won't claim him," she declared, her voice breaking on the last word, "then the state can have him. I am surrendering my son because I have nothing left to give him, and his father is a liar." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. David Chen shot to his feet, speechless. Marcus Thorne's jaw dropped. Richard Blackwood's mask of indifference finally cracked his face, a canvas of pure shock. Only Isabella Vance kept her composure. Her triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard satisfaction. This was better than she could have planned. The unstable, hysterical girl was handing over the evidence. The problem was solving itself. But Judge Thompson wasn't looking at Isabella. Her gaze was fixed on the tiny, innocent child being offered to her like a holy sacrament. She saw not a legal problem, but a human life caught in a storm of greed and deceit. And in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. It had all started with the scent of rain on hot asphalt. 6 months before Leo was born, Elena Reyes was just another face in the sea of ambitious young hopefuls at Blackwood Global. An intern in the marketing department, she was armed with a scholarship-funded business degree from NYU and a fierce determination to escape the paycheck-to-paycheck life she'd grown up with in Queens. The headquarters was a breathtaking steel and glass tower on Park Avenue that seemed to scrape the sky. To Elena, it was a symbol of everything she'd ever wanted: success, stability, a world away from leaky faucets and second-hand clothes. She was smart, hard-working, and often the first one in and the last one out. She learned names she anticipated needs, and she did her job with a quiet efficiency that got her noticed. She first met Richard Blackwood during a late-night work session for the company's new European expansion project. A sudden summer thunderstorm had knocked out the power on several floors, and while others panicked, Elena had methodically found emergency flashlights and started manually saving the crucial data from the servers. He'd found her in the dim glow of a laptop screen, her face etched with concentration. He wasn't flanked by his usual entourage of assistants and vice presidents. In the strange, quiet dark, he was just a man. "Didn't anyone tell you to go home?" he'd asked, his voice softer than the commanding tone he used in boardrooms. Elena had jumped, startled. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry, I was just trying to secure the presentation deck for the Zurich meeting." He'd smiled a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his severe features. "I see that. Thank you." He leaned against the door frame, the storm raging outside the panoramic windows behind him. "My father always said you find out who people really are when the lights go out." That was the beginning. It started with professional conversations, him asking her opinion on a marketing slogan, her offering an unexpectedly sharp insight on a consumer trend. He started seeking her out, his visits to the 34th floor becoming more frequent. The office buzzed with whispers. Elena knew all about Isabella Vance. Their engagement had been announced in a lavish spread in Vanity Fair. It was a merger of dynasties, a strategic alliance designed to consolidate power in their respective industries. Elena told herself she was being foolish, that she was just a momentary distraction for a man living under immense pressure. But the connection between them felt undeniable. With her, he wasn't Mr. Blackwood, the ruthless CEO. He was just Richard. He talked about his passion for sailing, his estranged relationship with his father, his feeling of being trapped in a life that had been designed for him, not chosen by him. "Isabella doesn't see me," he confessed one evening as they shared a taxi in the pouring rain, a silent agreement to pretend they were heading in the same direction. "She sees the Blackwood name, the brand. It's a transaction. With you, I feel like I can breathe." The first kiss happened in a freight elevator, a stolen, frantic moment that left them both breathless and terrified. It escalated quickly into a secret affair. They met in discreet hotels in a small private apartment he kept under a different name in Greenwich Village. For Elena, it was a whirlwind of intoxicating passion and profound guilt. She was falling in love with an engaged man, a cardinal sin she'd always judged others for. But he made her believe it was different. "Just give me time," he would plead, holding her close in the dead of night. "The merger with Vance Steele is everything. It's my legacy. Once it's finalized, I'll have the power to do what I want, to be with who I want." She, in her naivety and blinded by love, believed him. She saw him as a man trapped by duty, and she was his secret escape, his hope for a real life. She compartmentalized her guilt, focusing on the future he painted for them. Then, one humid August morning, 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test changed everything. Her first feeling was not fear, but a surge of dizzying, unadulterated joy. A baby. Their baby. This was not a problem. It was a solution, a reason for him to finally break free, to choose love over legacy. This child would make their secret real. She planned how to tell him perfectly. She booked a table at a quiet Italian restaurant they both loved, a place where they could talk, really talk. She arrived early, her heart thrumming with a nervous excitement she could barely contain. He was late. When he finally arrived, the warm, unguarded man she loved was gone. In his place was the CEO. His face was a mask of cold stress, his jaw tight. "I can't stay long," he said, not even meeting her eyes. "Isabella's father is in town. We have a dinner." The words tumbled out of Elena's mouth before she could stop them. "Richard, I have something to tell you. Something wonderful. I'm pregnant." She watched his face, expecting the initial shock to melt into joy. Instead, she saw it morph into something she had never seen before, pure, unadulterated panic. The blood drained from his face. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. How?" "What do you mean, how?" she asked, her own joy beginning to curdle into confusion. "Richard, it's ours." "This is a disaster," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "A complete and utter disaster." He looked up at her, and his eyes, those stormy gray eyes she loved, were suddenly the eyes of a stranger. They were cold, calculating, and full of a terrifying distance. "You have to get rid of it," he said, his voice low and firm. Elena felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. "Get rid of it, Richard. This is our baby." "It's a complication, Elena. An unacceptable complication. The merger is at its most critical stage. Isabella, if she found out..." He didn't need to finish. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. The gesture was so clinical, so insulting, it physically hurt her. "I'll take care of you. You can go away for a while. Get the procedure done. I'll give you enough money to start over anywhere you want. Just name your price." Name her price for their child's life. In that moment, the man she loved ceased to exist. In his place was a monster, a coward hiding behind his wealth. The love she felt for him curdled into a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she didn't know she possessed. "Don't be a fool, Elena," he hissed, his charm gone, replaced by raw menace. "You don't want to be my enemy. You have no idea what you'd be up against." He stood up, throwing a $100 bill on the table to cover her uneaten meal. He leaned down, his face close to hers. "Get it done," he ordered, "and then you will disappear. We never knew each other. Do you understand?" He walked away without looking back, leaving her alone in the crowded restaurant, the silent scream trapped in her throat. The dream was over. The glass tower had become a prison, and she had just been cast out into the cold, unforgiving storm. And she was carrying his son. The fallout was swift and brutal. Richard Blackwood was not a man who made idle threats. The very next day, Elena arrived at the office to find her security pass no longer worked. A stony-faced security guard escorted her to HR, where a woman she'd never met before handed her a box containing the contents of her desk and a termination letter citing corporate restructuring. There was no severance, only a veiled threat about the non-disclosure agreement she'd signed as an intern. Her company email was deactivated. Her calls to Richard's private number went straight to a disconnected message. He had scrubbed her from his life with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to a failing subsidiary. But the true architect of her destruction, she would soon realize, was not Richard, but the smiling serpent at his side. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from the law firm of Vance Thorne and Associates. It was a cease and desist order penned on behalf of Isabella Vance. It accused Elena of harassment and stalking, citing her unwanted and delusional attempts to contact Mr. Blackwood. It warned that any further communication would result in immediate legal action. Isabella was cleaning house. She must have suspected something, or perhaps Richard in his panic had confessed. Either way, Isabella was not merely a passive, jilted fiancée. She was an active participant in Elena's erasure. This wasn't just about protecting her marriage, it was about annihilating a rival. Elena's life began to unravel stitch by stitch. Her meager savings dwindled at an alarming rate. New York City, once a city of dreams, became a concrete jungle of impossible expenses. Her small apartment in Astoria, which she could barely afford even with her intern's salary, was now a looming financial catastrophe. She started looking for work, but doors that had once been open were now inexplicably slammed shut. She'd had promising interviews only to receive polite but firm rejections a day later. She couldn't prove it, but she felt the long, invisible reach of the Blackwood and Vance empires poisoning the well, blacklisting her from the industry she'd worked so hard to enter. Her friends, many of whom were colleagues from Blackwood Global, grew distant. They'd offer vague excuses, their eyes shifting away from hers. The message was clear: siding with Elena was career suicide. She was radioactive. The physical toll of the pregnancy combined with the crushing stress was debilitating. Morning sickness was a constant, unwelcome companion. Exhaustion was a blanket she couldn't shake off. Some days all she could do was lie in her darkening apartment, one hand on her growing belly, and weep for the life she had lost, and the life she was terrified she couldn't provide for her unborn child. She hit rock bottom in her 5th month of pregnancy. An eviction notice was taped to her door, its stark red letters a final humiliating blow. She sat on the floor of her half-empty apartment, surrounded by packing boxes she couldn't afford to move, and felt a despair so absolute it was almost peaceful. They had won. They had broken her. It was in that moment of utter hopelessness that a lifeline appeared in the most unexpected of forms. Her landlady, a kind, elderly Polish woman named Mrs. Gable, found her crying. Mrs. Gable had always been kind to her, often leaving small containers of homemade soup by her door. "They are doing this to you, the man in the fancy car." Mrs. Gable asked her English thick with an accent, but her eyes sharp with intuition. Elena, too broken to lie anymore, nodded, and the whole sordid story came pouring out. Mrs. Gable listened without judgment. When Elena was finished, she simply patted her hand. "In old country," she said, "when wolf corners you, you do not lie down to die. You find a bigger wolf, or a clever fox." Her clever fox was her nephew, David Chen. A recent law school graduate working at a non-profit legal aid society in the Bronx, David was everything Marcus Thorne was not. He was young, wore slightly rumpled suits, and operated out of a cramped, cluttered office that smelled of stale coffee and idealism. Elena met him there feeling a profound sense of shame. She laid out her story expecting him to show her the door. She had no money, no powerful allies, and a story that sounded like a tabloid headline. But David listened with an intensity that surprised her. He looked through the text messages she had saved the few photos they'd taken in secret. He saw the cease and desist letter from Isabella's firm. "They're counting on you being too poor and too scared to fight," he said, his eyes flashing with a spark of indignation. They think they can buy silence and bully you into submission. That's not just immoral, it's illegal. This is coercion. This is wrongful termination, and if that baby is his, this is a betrayal of the most fundamental duty a parent has. For the first time in months, Elena felt a flicker of hope. But I can't pay you. David leaned forward, his expression earnest. This isn't about money, Ms. Reyes. This is about justice. Cases like this is why I became a lawyer. We'll file for a paternity test. We'll sue for child support. We'll fight them. He paused, a wry smile on his face. They have a shark. You'll have a terrier. I don't let go. It was a long, arduous process. David filed the motions. Marcus Thorne's office responded with a blizzard of paperwork, delaying tactics, and motions to dismiss. They filed affidavits from Blackwood employees, swearing they had never seen any evidence of an inappropriate relationship. They submitted a psychiatric evaluation from a hired gun doctor, who after a single phone call suggested Elena was prone to erotomanic delusions. They were trying to bury them to bankrupt the Legal Aid Society with paperwork and billable hours. All the while, the press, tipped off by an anonymous source, began to circle. Tabloid articles appeared with headlines like, "Oh, Stalker's Baby Scheme," and "Intern's $1 Million Fantasy." They used a flattering, smiling photo of Richard and Isabella, and a grainy, unflattering candid of a heavily pregnant Elena, looking harassed and exhausted. Isabella was a master of public perception. She gave a tearful, exclusive interview to a major news network. "It's been a terrible ordeal," she'd said, dabbing a perfectly dry eye with a silk handkerchief. "This woman has created a fantasy to destroy our happiness. Richard is the kindest, most honorable man I know. He is the victim here. We both are." Watching it on the small TV in the homeless shelter, where she and the newborn Leo were now living, Elena felt her last embers of hope dying. The world saw her as a villain, a liar. It was David who kept her going. "It's all noise, Elena," he told her, his voice firm over the phone. "They're throwing mud because they're scared of the one thing that can't be bought or spun the truth. The DNA test, the judge granted it. That's our endgame. That's where the lies stop." That was the only thing she clung to as she walked into the courtroom. The truth. But seeing the smug confidence on Isabella's face, a terrible doubt began to creep in. Why did she look so certain? It was as if she knew something Elena didn't. It was as if she was absolutely, positively sure that the DNA test would prove Richard was not the father. And that terrifying confidence is what finally broke Elena, leading her to make that desperate final gambit of handing her son to the judge. Judge Thompson did not accept the child. Instead, she looked down from her bench, her face a mask of judicial calm, but her eyes conveyed a deep human gravity. She held up a hand, silencing the chaos that had erupted in her courtroom. "Bailiff, please give the child back to his mother," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Elena, trembling, took Leo back into her arms, shame washing over her. The judge then fixed her steely gaze on Richard and Isabella. "I have seen enough," she declared. "The theatrics in this courtroom will end now. The back and forth accusations, the character assassinations, they are irrelevant. There is only one piece of evidence that can and will resolve this matter." She turned to her clerk. "I am ordering an immediate court-supervised DNA test for Mr. Blackwood and the child Leo Reyes. The samples will be taken today at this courthouse by a court-appointed technician. The results will be delivered directly to my chambers. Is that understood?" Marcus Thorne stood. "Your Honor, we object. This is an invasion of my client's privacy based on a baseless allegation. Your objection is noted and overruled, Mr. Thorne, the judge snapped. Your client will either submit to a DNA test willingly, or I will hold him in contempt of court, and he can submit to one from a cell in Rikers Island. The choice is his. The threat hung in the air, thick and potent. Richard Blackwood, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. The color drained from his face. He exchanged a panicked look with Isabella, but her expression was strangely calm. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze and nodded a subtle, confident gesture. Whatever fear she had was gone, replaced by that same unnerving certainty. Richard took a deep breath and gave a stiff nod. I will comply, Your Honor. The process was sterile and humiliating. Elena David. Richard and Thorne were escorted to a small, windowless room. A technician swabbed the inside of Leo's cheek first, the baby fussing at the intrusion. Then she turned to Richard. He flinched slightly as she took his sample, his jaw clenched tight. The swabs were sealed in evidence bags, labeled and signed. It was done. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Elena's life. She and Leo were placed in a slightly better temporary housing facility, a small but clean apartment thanks to an emergency grant David had secured. But the reprieve from homelessness did little to quiet the storm in her mind. Isabella's confidence haunted her. Why had she been so calm, so sure of herself? Had Richard lied about being with other women? Could Leo somehow not be his? The thought was a dagger to her heart. She knew it was impossible. Leo was the spitting image of his father. But the doubt planted by Isabella's smug certainty began to grow like a poisonous weed. What if they found a way to tamper with the test? With their money and influence, anything seemed possible. David assured her the chain of custody was ironclad, supervised by the court itself. They can't touch this, Elena. This is the one place their power can't reach. On the day the results were due, Elena couldn't eat. She dressed Leo in a soft blue sleeper, the nicest outfit he owned. When she held him, her hands were trembling so badly she was afraid she might drop him. David met her at the courthouse, giving her a supportive, if nervous, smile. The atmosphere in the courtroom was even more electric than before. The press had caught wind of the court-ordered test, and the public gallery was packed. Richard and Isabella swept in looking like a royal couple arriving at a state function. Today, Isabella wore a blood-red dress, a bold, predatory statement. She met Elena's gaze across the room and gave her a slow, deliberate smile that chilled Elena to the bone. It was the smile of a chess master who had already cornered the king. All rise. Judge Thompson entered her face, unreadable. She sat and took a moment, her eyes sweeping over the silent, expectant faces. In her hand was a single sealed manila envelope. The fate of everyone in the room was contained within its flimsy paper confines. I have the results of the DNA analysis performed by OmniGen Labs on the samples provided by Mr. Richard Blackwood and the minor child Leo Reyes. She announced, her voice echoing in the profound silence. She methodically tore open the envelope. The sound was like a gunshot. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and read it to herself first. Her expression did not change by so much as a flicker of an eyelash. Elena felt her heart was going to pound its way out of her chest. She held Leo tighter, burying her face in his soft hair, unable to watch. Richard stared straight ahead, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Isabella, however, leaned forward slightly. that predatory smile still playing on her lips, her eyes glittering with anticipation for the final killing blow. Judge Thompson cleared her throat. "The report states," she said, her voice clear and measured, "that based on the analysis of the genetic markers, the alleged father, Richard Blackwood, is not excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Reyes." A confused murmur rippled through the room. Not excluded. What did that mean? Marcus Thorne let out a barely audible sigh of relief. It wasn't a yes. It was ambiguous. But the judge wasn't finished. "It goes on to state," she continued, her eyes lifting from the page to stare directly at Richard Blackwood, "the probability of paternity is 99.999%. Silence. A stunned, absolute void of sound. Then chaos. A camera flash went off in the gallery, a sudden pop of light. David Chen gasped, grabbing Elena's arm in triumph. Elena herself felt a wave of dizziness so intense she had to grip the table to stay upright. Vindication. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was a tidal wave of raw, agonizing vindication. She started to cry silent tears streaming down her face, dripping onto her baby's head. Marcus Thorne looked as if he'd been punched in the gut, his face turning a pasty shade of gray. Richard Blackwood simply stared, his mouth slightly agape, his carefully constructed world shattering around him in slow motion. But the most dramatic reaction came from Isabella Vance. Her smile did not just fade. It shattered. It fell from her face like a broken mask, revealing an expression of pure, unadulterated shock and horror. Her perfectly painted lips trembled, her blue eyes wide with disbelief. "No," she breathed the word, a tiny, lost sound. "No, that's not possible. It's impossible." Her outburst, raw and unfiltered, drew every eye in the courtroom. It was a crack in the flawless facade, revealing something ugly and frantic underneath. Why was she so shocked? A fiancé finding out her partner had fathered a child would be angry, betrayed. But this was different. This was utter fundamental disbelief, as if she had just witnessed the laws of physics being broken. Judge Thompson banged her gavel. "Order, order, in this court." But Isabella was already on her feet, her composure utterly gone. She turned to Richard, her face contorted with a mixture of fury and panic. "How?" she shrieked, her voice shrill. "How is this possible? Tell me!" Richard, still reeling, could only stammer. "Isabella, I can explain." "Explain what?" she screamed now, oblivious to the judge, the press, the entire world. "That you're a liar. We both know you can't have children. We both know about the vasectomy." The second bombshell detonated in the silent courtroom, more powerful than the first. A vasectomy. The word hung in the air, charged and radioactive. If Richard Blackwood had a vasectomy, then he couldn't be the father. The DNA test had to be wrong. Or something else was. Isabella's confident smirk suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. She hadn't been bluffing. She had been holding the ultimate trump card. She believed with absolute certainty that Richard was sterile. So how in God's name was he Leo's father? The revelation of the vasectomy sent a shockwave through the courtroom that dwarfed the DNA results. Marcus Thorne. Richard's own lawyer looked at his client with a stunned, accusatory expression. He'd been lied to. David Chen stared, his mind racing to connect the dots of a puzzle that had just become infinitely more complex. "A vasectomy." Judge Thompson's voice was dangerously quiet. She directed her question to Richard, who looked like a cornered animal. "Mr. Blackwood, is what Ms. Vance says true? Have you had a vasectomy?" Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the furious judge and his unraveling fiancée. "Yes, Your Honor," he mumbled. "Years ago, after a health scare in college." Thorne threw his hands up in exasperation. "Then the lab made a mistake. The results are fraudulent. We demand a new test, a full investigation into Omnigen Labs." But David Chen was already on his feet, a sudden brilliant flash of insight on his face. He'd seen Isabella's shock. It was genuine. She wasn't acting. She truly believed Richard was sterile, which meant Richard had told her he was. But the DNA test, a 99.999% certainty, was science. It didn't lie. "Your Honor," David said, his voice cutting through Thorne's blustering. "There's only one way for both of those facts to be true. A vasectomy isn't always permanent." He turned his gaze to Richard Blackwood, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Blackwood, did you ever have the procedure reversed?" The question hung in the air. It was the missing piece. Richard Blackwood paled, the last vestiges of his power and control evaporating under the weight of that question. He looked at Elena, and for a fleeting second she saw a flicker of the man he used to be vulnerable, haunted. He had kept a secret not just from the court, but from the woman he was supposed to marry. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge prompted, her patience worn thin. He finally broke, slumping in his chair, as if the strings holding him upright had been cut. "Yes," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I had it reversed, about 1.5 years ago." 1.5 years ago. Right in the middle of his passionate, secret affair with Elena. The timeline clicked into place for everyone in the room. He hadn't just been having a fling. At some point in those stolen nights and whispered conversations about the future, he had done something profound. He had undone his sterility, secretly paving the way for a potential life with Elena, a life where they could have a family, a life he never once mentioned to his fiancée, Isabella. The betrayal was now twofold and infinitely deeper. He hadn't just cheated on Isabella. He had planned a potential future with another woman while using Isabella for her money and connections. And he hadn't just abandoned Elena. He had abandoned a future he himself had secretly set in motion, throwing away the child that was a direct result of that secret choice. Isabella stared at him, her expression shifting from rage to a dawning, sickening understanding. Her entire relationship, her entire future was a lie. She wasn't his partner. She was his business strategy. Elena hadn't been a fling. She had been his escape plan. "You had it reversed. For her." Isabella's voice was hollow, all the fight gone out of it, replaced by the brittle sound of a heart breaking. Richard couldn't answer. He just stared at his hands, a fallen king, in a kingdom of his own making. The story now unspooled with horrifying clarity. Elena and Richard's affair was deeper than anyone knew. He had loved her, or at least believed he did enough to see a future with her, enough to undergo a secret surgery to have a child with her. But when that child became a reality, the pressure of the Vance merger, the billion-dollar legacy, had proven stronger than his love. He had panicked and chosen money over his own flesh and blood. Isabella's supreme confidence was also explained. She had likely discovered the affair. But armed with the knowledge of Richard's vasectomy, she saw a clear path to victory. She would let Elena make her claim. She would let it go to court. She would watch as the DNA test inevitably came back negative, publicly and humiliatingly exposing Elena as a delusional liar and a fraud. She would be rid of her rival forever, and Richard, shamed and grateful, would be bound to her more tightly than ever. It was a perfect, vicious plan, except it was built on a foundation of sand, on a secret Richard had kept from everyone. "This court," Judge Thompson said, her voice filled with a quiet fury, "finds that Richard Blackwood is the legal and biological father of the child, Leo Reyes Blackwood." She added the surname with deliberate emphasis. "A hearing will be set to determine child support, retroactive payments, and health coverage. And Mr. Blackwood," she added, her eyes like chips of ice, "I would advise you to secure new counsel, as Mr. Thorne appears to have been operating without knowledge of the basic facts of your life." She banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." As the room exploded into a frenzy of reporters shouting questions, Elena just sat there, holding her son. The truth was out, but it was uglier and more painful than she could have ever imagined. The man she had loved had not only discarded her, he had meticulously planned a future with her and then dismantled it when it became inconvenient. Across the room, the final act of Richard and Isabella's drama was playing out. "You lied to me." Isabella was hissing, her face a mask of pure hatred. "My father will ruin you. The merger is dead. Everything is dead." She turned and stormed out of the courtroom, a whirlwind of red silk and shattered pride, leaving Richard to face the ruins alone. Richard finally looked up, his eyes finding Elena's across the sea of chaos. His face was a wreck of shame, regret, and desperation. He took a tentative step toward her, as if to speak, to apologize, to beg. But Elena just clutched Leo tighter, turned her back on him, and let David Chen guide her away from the wreckage. She had won, but it felt astonishingly like she had lost everything all over again. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation was a media firestorm. The story of the millionaire CEO, the secret vasectomy reversal, the spurned intern, and the scorned heiress was irresistible. Paparazzi camped outside Elena's temporary housing, shouting questions whenever she dared to peek out. News vans were a permanent fixture outside the Blackwood Global headquarters. The financial and social fallout for Richard was cataclysmic. Just as Isabella had promised her father, a ruthless old-world tycoon named Alistair Vance pulled the plug on the merger. In a scathing press release, he cited a fundamental breach of trust and character on Richard Blackwood's part. The stock of Blackwood Global plummeted overnight. The board of directors, once fiercely loyal, began to murmur about invoking morality clauses in his contract. Richard Blackwood, the golden boy of Wall Street, was now toxic. He tried to reach out to Elena. There were dozens of calls from blocked numbers, emails from newly created accounts flooding David's inbox, and even a ridiculously large bouquet of white roses sent to the shelter with a simple handwritten card that said, "I am so sorry. We need to talk." Elena told David to refuse it all. "What is there to talk about?" she asked, her voice weary. "He can talk to you about Leo's trust fund. That's it. There is no we. The battle had been won, but the war had left her scarred. The vindication she felt was hollowed out by the sheer depth of his betrayal. To know he had secretly prepared for a life with her, only to discard her and their child so casually, was a wound far deeper than the simple abandonment she had first believed. A court date was set to formalize the child support agreement. This time Richard arrived looking like a ghost. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, his face was gaunt, and the confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, hesitant gait. Marcus Thorne was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber family lawyer. Isabella was, of course, nowhere to be seen. The proceedings were swift. Richard did not contest anything. Through his lawyer, he agreed to a generous monthly support payment to cover all of Leo's medical and educational expenses up to university, and to create a multi-million-dollar trust fund in Leo's name, which he would not be able to touch, but which Elena would manage. As the judge finalized the order, Richard spoke up for the first time, his voice raspy. "Your Honor, may I address Ms. Reyes?" The judge looked at Elena, who gave a slight, reluctant nod. Richard turned in his chair to face her fully. The entire courtroom leaned in to listen. "Elena," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words to describe how sorry I am. There's no excuse for what I did. I was a coward. I was so terrified of losing the empire my father built, of failing, that I destroyed the only real thing in my life." And he looked at Leo, who was sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms. "He's my son, I know that now. I threw away my chance to be his father, and I will regret that every day for the rest of my life. I know I don't deserve it, but I am asking, begging, for a chance to be in his life, to know him." Elena listened, her expression unmoving. She had fantasized about this moment, about him groveling, begging for forgiveness. But now that it was here, she felt nothing but a profound, aching sadness. When he was finished, she took a deep breath. "You don't get to do that, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying across the silent room. "You don't get to break everything and then ask to be let back in because you're sorry now that you've lost it all. You're not sorry for what you did to me. You're sorry for what it cost you." She stood up, holding Leo close. "Leo will know who his father is, and when he is old enough, he can choose if he wants to know you. That will be his decision. But you and I, we are finished. You will provide for him because that is your legal and moral duty. But you don't get to be a father just when it's convenient. You have to be a man first. And you failed at that." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Richard Blackwood sitting alone at the table, a man who had everything, and now had nothing that mattered. The next few months were about building a new life. Using the first of the support payments, Elena and David found a beautiful, sunny, two-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood far from the shadows of her past. For the first time, she could buy Leo everything he needed without checking the price tag. She bought him soft blankets, a sturdy crib, and toys he could grow into. She also enrolled in night classes to get a master's degree in digital marketing. She was determined to build her own career to ensure that she and Leo would never be dependent on Richard's money or anyone else's. One day, David Chen stopped by the apartment with some paperwork. He looked around at the bright, happy home she had created at Leo, babbling in his playpen. "You did it, Elena," he said, a proud smile on his face. "You went up against a giant and won." "We won, David," she corrected him, handing him a cup of coffee. "I couldn't have done it without you." "I just filed the paperwork," he said with a shrug. "You're the one who was brave enough to fight." He paused, then asked, "Have you heard from him?" Elena shook her head. "His lawyer sends the checks. That's it. I saw in the news he was forced to step down as CEO." It was true. The board had finally ousted him. He still owned a majority of the company, but he was no longer its king. The empire he had sacrificed his son for had been taken from him anyway. As for Isabella, she had disappeared from public life. Rumors swirled that she had moved to Europe, that she had checked into a private wellness retreat, that her father had disowned her for the public humiliation she had brought upon their name. Her perfect, vicious plan had backfired, destroying her own life in the process. Sometimes late at night, when Leo was asleep, Elena would look at her son and see Richard in the curve of his smile or the intensity of his gaze. A pang of sadness would hit her for the family they could have been. But then she would look around at the peaceful home she had built, at the future she was creating for them, a future based on strength and truth, not secrets and lies. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had made the right choice. She hadn't just won a court case. She had won back her life. 5 years passed. The world with its short memory largely moved on. Richard Blackwood became a cautionary tale whispered in Wall Street boardrooms. Blackwood Global, under new leadership, rebranded and recovered. Isabella Vance was never heard from publicly again. But in a sun-drenched apartment overlooking a park in Brooklyn, a new world had been built. Elena Reyes was no longer the frightened intern or the desperate mother. She had earned her master's degree with honors and had started her own small but successful digital marketing consultancy, specializing in helping non-profits and ethical startups. She was respected, self-sufficient, and happy. Her life revolved around Leo. He was a bright, energetic, and incredibly kind 5-year-old. He had his father's stormy gray eyes, but his mother's warm, infectious smile. Elena had been true to her word. She never lied to him about his father. As he grew old enough to ask questions, she answered them simply and honestly, without bitterness. "Your dad and I cared about each other, but he wasn't ready to be a father," she would say. "But he helps me take care of you to make sure you have everything you need." She had a single framed photo of Richard from his younger, softer days on a bookshelf, so Leo would know his face. The trust fund managed wisely by Elena had grown. But she was determined that Leo would not grow up to be a spoiled trust fund baby. She lived comfortably, but modestly, teaching him the value of hard work and kindness, things money could never buy. Richard had respected her wishes. He never tried to force contact. Once a year on Leo's birthday, a large, simple package would arrive. It was never extravagant. One year, it was a beautifully illustrated book of constellations. Another, it was a high-quality beginner's telescope. Last year, it was a wooden sailboat model, a nod to a passion he had once shared with Elena. There was never a card from Dad, only a small typed note that said, "Thinking of you on your birthday." Elena always let Leo have the gifts. It was a silent, fragile truce, a way for Richard to be a ghost of a presence in his son's life without overstepping the boundaries she had set. On Leo's 6th birthday, Elena threw a party in the park. It was a joyous, chaotic affair with a dozen of his little friends, a superhero cake, and a mountain of presents. As she watched Leo tear open a gift from his best friend, her heart swelled with a pure, uncomplicated happiness. Later that afternoon, as the party was winding down, she saw a man standing at a distance near a large oak tree at the edge of the park. He was leaning against the trunk, half hidden in the shadows. He was thinner than she remembered his dark hair, now flecked with gray at the temples. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, but a simple pair of jeans and a dark jacket. It was Richard. Her heart leapt into her throat. Her first instinct was to grab Leo to run. The old fear, the old anger flared for a moment. But then, it subsided. This was not the arrogant CEO from the courtroom. This was a man watching his son's birthday party from 100 yards away like a ghost at a feast. He didn't approach. He just watched. He watched as Leo laughed, as he blew out his candles, as he hugged his mother. Elena could almost feel the weight of his regret, a tangible force carried on the autumn breeze. After a few minutes, he seemed to sense her watching him. He met her gaze across the expanse of the park. He didn't smile or wave. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, It was a nod of acknowledgement, of respect, of thanks. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the city streets. Elena stood there for a long time, watching him go. The anger she had held onto for so long had finally completely dissolved. In its place was a quiet, somber understanding. He was paying his price. Not with money, but with distance. With a lifetime of watching from the sidelines, of knowing the son he would never get to teach how to sail a boat or gaze at the stars with. She looked at Leo, who was now chasing a balloon, his laughter echoing through the park. He was her legacy. Not a corporate empire built on deals and secrets, but a human being built on love, resilience, and truth. She had faced the worst of life and had not only survived, but thrived. She had found a different kind of wealth, a different kind of power. And as she called her son's name, watching him run into her open arms, she knew she had everything she would ever need. Elena's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest battles aren't fought in boardrooms or won with money, but in the quiet, desperate chambers of the human heart. It's a story about a mother's unbreakable love, a love so fierce it forced an empire to its knees. She walked into that courtroom with nothing but her child and the truth, and in the end, that proved to be more powerful than all the wealth and influence in the world. She taught us that true strength isn't about the power you wield over others, but about the integrity you maintain when you have nothing left to lose. Her journey from a betrayed intern to a self-made independent mother is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. If Elena's fight for justice and truth touched your heart, please help us share her story by hitting that like button. Let us know in the comments what part of her journey moved you the most. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next real-life story of triumph against all odds. Thank you for listening.